Yeah, they've been very clear that there'll be no backtracking, if you will. Interestingly, the government also, while they said they will talk about fiscal consolidation, so how to spend less in order to have to borrow less with fewer tax receipts coming in, but that announcement is not expected until, for now, at least November. So it creates a lot of uncertainty, even as the government is trying to project kind of confidence and certainty by saying they're sticking with their plans. So that turmoil we've seen of late will probably stay with us for some time.
Yeah. I'm interested in your thoughts because it comes at a time of great volatility globally. So how might what is happening and this added chaos, if you like, that the UK government has caused, how is this going to feed into the global picture?
Well, sadly for the UK, and I put myself in that box, obviously, the effects will be strongest here at home, but there are a couple of ways that it could feed into the global economy. One is, of course, through currency ruction. So we, of course, seen the pound slumping considerably. Any of those who do a considerable amount of trade with the UK or are reliant on the UK economy will be negatively affected as a proxy of that, naturally. And then the major concern for me is the rise in interest rates. So for what we see so far, the BOE, the central bank here, will be forced to raise interest rates even higher than it was anticipating prior to this budget announcement and the market collapse that followed. And that comes at a time when we're already heading into what's likely to be a recession in the UK. So these are not two things that you see typically happening together, the economy entering recession and interest rates rising. It's necessary to get a handle on inflation, but of course it's going to make the economic hit much more considerable. So you see potentially that feeding into the global economy as well. Again, as trade partners and reliant economies start to feel that pain.
Yeah, because the thing is, the UK economy is not an island, the country may be, but, you know, it is a very big global player. How problematic is the US dollar at the moment? Because that is so strong, it's causing a lot of issues for a lot of other currencies, a lot of other countries.
Hugely problematic. And the US dollar was already strong. But whenever we see uncertainty like what's happened in the UK, or any other kind of global economic uncertainty, that tends to reinforce the dollar further. So we see investment flowing into US treasuries. That strengthens the dollar as well. And we just see investor demand for the dollar, which is a safe haven currency. The dollar, typically the yen, but less so this year, and gold are where investors tend to put their cash when they're worried about what's happening in the world. So all of that uncertainty just adds more pain by strengthening the dollar and hitting the pound as a result. So that means that imports into the UK are going to be way more expensive than they were previously. We have to remember that oil and a lot of energy, kind of including other products, trade is priced in dollars. So for anyone outside the UK or elsewhere who imports energy, if it's done in US dollars, which for most except for China it is, that's going to be much more expensive than it was before. And again, this was already one of the major problems we were facing, was soaring energy prices without the currency problem on top.
Yeah. How then is this package possibly going to tackle the issue of inflation and the prospect of going into a recession?
Well, I think, not wanting to put myself in the government's shoes, but I think it wasn't really meant to tackle inflation. It was meant to tackle growth. The idea that this government had was that by cutting taxes, you stimulate economic activity, and then over time, perhaps inflation will fall, if I can follow that logic there. But I think, to be honest, the concern there was not inflation, it was growth. And unfortunately, because inflation is high, interest rates are rising and will now have to rise further, that as a result, the kind of economic reality, apart from the ideology, is that growth is going to be hit, and now even more so.
How unusual, I mean, the way this sort of package came about, you know, there was no consultation, it seems, with the policy people that know the right moves to make in these kind of circumstances. The Bank of England has made this unprecedented intervention. How unusual is that from your experience?
Oh, it's all very strange, to be sure. We don't have a lot of precedent for this. But I think we can say that really about the last year. There's not been precedent for anything in the COVID produced economic recession that we saw around the world. No precedent for that. No precedent for the recovery either. And so, really, over the last few years, in all major economies, we've seen policy kind of moves meant to deal with problems we've not seen before. Some of them have been successful, many of them have been unsuccessful. A lot of the inflation that we're seeing today, not all of it, but a lot of it is because we have such strong demand that came out of the fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus that was meant to lift us out of the COVID recession, which was necessary at the time, but led to soaring prices because there was just more cash floating around. So policymaking, to be sure, is not a job I would particularly want to have at the moment. We're all kind of stumbling around in the dark a little bit.
Yeah. Is it inevitable that there's going to be a global recession, and should governments be trying to resist it so fervently? Because, we go into recessions, we go into booms, we go into bust. It's part of the cycle. But it seems in these days, governments want to avoid that at all cost, no matter what the debt is that they rack up along the way.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And unfortunately, governments have the constant trouble of having to think about being re-elected whenever the time comes, which does shorten and at times divert the things that they get to think about and legislate for. Potentially beneficially, central banks are the ones who are thinking to a certain extent about inflation. So we've seen the Fed, for example, in the US saying that they will be willing to do everything it takes to raise interest rates to tamp down inflation, even between the lines, if that means prompting a recession. Of course, they don't want to do that. But if it's what's necessary to make sure that inflation, particularly inflation expectations, so what consumers think prices are going to do in the next few years, which are critical to actually ensuring that it does stay low, all of that is really essential. So we have central bankers removed from that politics element that does mean that decision making is occasionally hampered, saying that maybe a recession is necessary, but if so, it'll get us to a healthier place. So near-term pain, long-term gain, and it's nice that somebody can take a long-term view.
Cailin, appreciate you trying to make sense of this, as you pointed out, situations that really have been without precedent for some time. Good to talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you.